this okay here? You need to reach in?
No,
and
no,
in this? Okay.
I'm a
That was
real.
right there.
Good morning, HASP scholars. Who do I sound like? HASP scholars. I love it when Fred speaks to us that way, don't you? I want to welcome you. I'm Sharon Nelson Arnsource, president this year, and I welcome you on behalf of the monthly program committee to those of you here and to those of you on streaming online. We're glad you're with us today. And as a reminder, it is time to silence those cell phones. Thank you. This is the beginning, we're at the early part of our fall 2 academic program year. There's 6 more weeks to go, and we still have lots of exciting courses on the schedule, and most of them are still available for you to sign up. And you can get there by simply clicking on the course you're interested in in the HASP happenings, and it'll take you right to the registration page. So please take advantage of some of these exciting courses that are still in place through the first week of December. The Communications Committee invites HASP members to submit contributions for publication in the HASP Review that'll be coming out this coming spring. The HASP Review offers an opportunity for those of us who would like to share some of our talents through poetry or short memoir pieces or articles, and even some art that can be copied in there. If you are interested in submitting something, you can be sent to Ralph Fairbanks, who is the chair of the committee, or to the office at hasp@hope.edu. No, whatever it is, the HASP office, not to Amy, not to Ian, but to the HASP office. You'll figure it out, okay? I want you to know that a few of my poems have been printed in the HASP Review. So that means I can claim myself as a published poet. So I really encourage you to enter the publication stream and join me in being published. We really would like to have lots of folks sharing interesting stories or whatever you would like to share with the community. Next Monday, we will be launching the much anticipated HASP Forward survey. And it's going to come to you as a link in a separate email online. It'll take you to the survey. And it's really important that we have as much feedback as possible, from as many of you as possible, because otherwise we'll have a skewed representation. And I know some of you are not savvy with the computer skills, so we're going to set up a designated computer in the office with some help to help you do that online. That won't be up until next week when the survey is up and operational. There'll be different kinds of questions on the survey, some easy yes, no, or check a box for your preference. There'll be some evaluative or rating questions that on a scale of 1 to 5, and where do you fall on this scale? There'll be some open-ended questions. We're really looking at the big picture of HASP, so the survey will take a little bit of time, but it's really going to be important for all of us. So today I thought I'd give you a really quick online in-person survey. You ready? I think you can do it, okay? Now, I want you to know that online, those will be anonymous. But for today, I think I'm going to have you raise your hands. Okay. Number 1, do you participate in the monthly program? Check a box or raise your hand. Yes? 100%! Look at that! Oh, what excitement. Okay, this one's going to be a little bit more difficult. This is a scale one. On a scale of 1 to 5, how important is your involvement in HASP at this stage of your life? Where 1 is not at all important and 5 is extremely important. Okay, so pick the number between 1 and 5 that's going to work best for you. Ready? Okay. How important is your involvement in HASP at this stage of your life? 1, not at all important. Good job. 2, somewhat unimportant. 3, important. 4, very important. 5, extremely important. That's cool. We had a range, and that range went from 3 to 5. I didn't see any, or you were sitting on your hands and not willing to vote on the 1s and 2s. Good. Thank you. And here's the last one. Now, there are no right or wrong questions on the survey, but I'm going to give you a hint on this one. This has a very much preferred response. Okay. Will you participate in the HASP Forward online survey? Yes? Or no? Good job. I really and truly urge all of you to go to the online survey next week when it's up on the when you get the email. It's really, really important that we gather information from all of you. The board values that information as we continue to look at who we are now and where we want to go in the future. We want to set that direction according to your wishes and your feedback. So finally, as we gather today on this first day of November, we enter a season of Thanksgiving. And two things I'm thankful for this morning. They are the visitors that are here among us and the new HASP members that are present today. Membership Chairperson Doug Walberg will put names and faces to this gratitude. Thank you.
Well, we are very pleased to have 9 guests attending this morning, and I would like to welcome each of you by name. So with us today are Christy Turner, Steve Turner, Carol Hintz, Peter Hintz, Mark Nusma, Birgit Meyerd, Linda Hofer, Ed Karcher, and Celia Karcher. We're just delighted that you're here. You're going to hear a very interesting program. We're anxious for you to learn a lot about HASP, and we're really anxious for you to join us. We're also pleased to welcome and introduce 13 new members today. And as I read your name, I'd like you to stand, turn around, and look at your fellow HASP members and give us a chance to greet and recognize you. I realize some of our new members may be attending online. But joining HASP today are Linda Brown, Rick Brown, Darius Conger, Vivian Conger, Gary Kemper, Tim Lath, Candace Malavuk, Dave Malavuk, Jean Seller-Gifford, Lynn Sheehan, Patricia Sterling, Dirk Van Beek, and Gretchen Vogelzang. So please join me in giving a HASP welcome to our guests and new members. I'm sure you know people who would really enjoy HASP, get a lot out of HASP, so please talk us up, talk to your friends, bring them to a monthly meeting, and we'd love to have them join us as well. So thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I'm honored to introduce our guest speaker today for a couple of reasons. The first reason is that he is one of the preeminent presidential historians of our time. Whenever I think of, say, John Meacham or Doris Kearns Goodwin or Michael Beschloss, the name Gleaves Whitney comes to mind. I think of them as the Gang of Four when it comes to presidential commentators. You could add a few more names: Richard Norton Smith, H.W. Brands, Doug Brinkley. But Gleaves Whitney, at least in my book, is right up there at the top of the heap. The other reason is that he was largely responsible for the cast we put together for Inventing America, the PBS miniseries that we filmed here at Hope a few years ago. Bill Barker, for example, who played Thomas Jefferson, I remember meeting him at a program on Mount Rushmore presidents that Gleaves organized when he ran the Hauenstein Center at Grand Valley State University. Gleaves introduced me to him in the lobby afterwards. Bill was still in costume, still in character. He looked like him, talked like him, probably even smelled like him, because people didn't bathe as much in those days as they do now. it was like meeting Jefferson in the flesh. I mean, I could feel the blood rush down to my feet. Anyway, it was Gleaves who put me in touch with Bill Barker and other historical interpreters, as they're called, from Colonial Williamsburg and other places, who played key parts in the show, and I'm deeply grateful to Gleaves for that. Now, I want to say that as a historian, Gleaves doesn't just dwell in the past. He's very much in tune with the present, which is why he's here today. 2 years ago, after running the Hauenstein Center for Presidential Studies for many years, he took a new position as executive director of the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Museum in Grand Rapids, whose mission is to foster public awareness of the life and legacy of our 38th president. Gleaves, among his many other accomplishments, is the author or editor of 17 books and the author of an online column called Ask Gleaves, in which he answers questions about American presidents from political junkies around the world. So, what's he going to talk about today? Well, as you know, we have a midterm election coming up next week, and it comes at a time when we're more divided as a nation than we have been in any of our lifetimes. I think most of us would agree that Gerald Ford, our 38th president and a favorite son of West Michigan, was a uniter, not a divider. What lesson can we learn from him today? Do the principles and values he exemplified have any sway in today's political climate? Could he be elected today? And if not, what does this say about the state of American democracy? So that's what Gleaves is going to talk about, and nobody is better qualified to do that than he is. So please extend a warm welcome to my friend Gleaves Whitney. Claudia asked me to take this mic away since you'll have a...
I have my mic, thanks. What a wonderful introduction. It's great to be with you all at HASP. I think this is the second time I've addressed HASP in my career in West Michigan, so I'm not from here originally, but it's always great to be back, and I could just tell from my conversations in the lobby with you, and can everybody hear me? Okay. I could tell from my conversations with you that you very much enjoy reading and traveling and talking about current events, so we're going to have a good time this morning. And I knew that we would have a good time when Milt kindly invited me to come and address you, because Milt's one of my favorite people in Holland, and gosh, what he's been able to do as a public historian is just remarkable with this series of the founders. And I just want to say, Milt knows this, we're having Bill Barker, Thomas Jefferson, come back to West Michigan on November 17th. He'll be down at the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Museum. So stay tuned. If you go to our website at the foundation or the museum, you'll be able to get the details. So I hope, well, I expect to see you there. You'll get to see Thomas Jefferson yourself. Let's provide a little context right off the bat. You know, when we talk about presidents, we love to divide them into the good presidents, but the bad presidents are a lot more fun to talk about, right? They're the ones who have all the scandals. And so we're attracted to scandals and that kind of thing. But if I were to ask you, who are the top 3 or 4 presidents of the United States? What would you say? Lincoln? Washington? Reagan? FDR. I can't believe it. It's like boom, 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 boom. See, I said, when I was telling my wife this morning that I'm going to love this talk, I said, because those folks in HASP are so informed. They're good readers. See, I didn't even have to pull it out of you. You named the 4 tops that if you ask the public and you ask professional historians and political scientists, they always come back to those 4 as the top. Now, sometimes Reagan is displaced. There'll be TR that slips in there, or Kennedy. Kennedy's star is rising right now. My friend Mark Updegrove, for example, just wrote a book on Kennedy. He's my counterpart at the LBJ in Austin. And he would argue that LBJ should be the 4th best. But it just goes to show you that there's a consensus about the top 3. Just about every audience I speak to. Now, unless I go to the South, you got to realize, I don't think you'll hear it this morning, but I'm a Texan originally. Milt very kindly left that out. This is either a conversation stopper or a starter up here in Michigan, but originally I'm from Texas. And so down in Texas, if you ask an audience who the best presidents were, Lincoln sometimes ends up like near the very bottom. And so we have some interesting conversations. I personally think Lincoln does deserve either the number 1 or the number 2 spot in the canon of these presidents. Now, take a look at this. This is going to be I'm going to get to Ford here in just a minute. Well, let me ask you this before I qualify that. How many of you think that Ford was a good president? I see 2 people who do not think he was a good president. Was he a mediocre president? Okay, we have a bold person over here in West Michigan. Mediocre? Both of you think he was mediocre? Okay. How many of you think he was a good man? Does anybody in this auditorium think that Gerald Ford was not a good man? Anybody? Nobody? Nobody? Okay, actually, you're just kind of, you know where I'm getting at here. With younger audiences, sometimes I can trip them up and then lure them into a trap. But I can't do that with this audience. No, you're absolutely right. I will not be arguing that Gerald Ford was a great president. I will argue that he was a great man, a great human being. And I hope to earn that thesis before we're finished today. I need to earn it as the speaker with a very intelligent, with it audience. Now, great presidents, we think of Washington. Why? Because he was the one who put it together. In a world of hostile monarchs, he said, we're going to do something new. We're going to found a republic. So he had the whole opinion of the world fighting him. And so he had a Herculean task to make sure that this republic got off to a good start. He was aware that everything he did would be scrutinized, criticized, lambasted. But that was Washington. He was strong enough to withstand it. He endured, and he set 17 precedents in all for future presidents. Then Lincoln. Lincoln is certainly up there because if Washington had to establish us, found us as a constitutional republic, Lincoln, as you know, had to save it. The sectional divides had gotten so severe, and we're not just talking north-south. We're talking the West. The West was severely divided. Lincoln had to deal with 3 regions of the United States, north, south, and west, and a whole lot of foreign policy troubles once France and Great Britain were trying to meddle, once we were in the Civil War. People don't realize Lincoln was not just about coming to the White House and unifying North and South. That's what we think of. But there's an entirely different project. And this is what makes Lincoln so great. This is what makes Lincoln hard to contain in a book. Because he also knew that in addition to North and South, he had to pull in the West. Remember, bleeding Kansas. All of the battles in the Civil War in the West. You know, Missouri, for example, had the third most number of battles in the Civil War. How many people think of that today? So Lincoln had this project, as you know. I mean, it's the Transcontinental Railroad coming west to unify the country. It's unifying the markets. You know, it's founding a land-grant university system. For those of you who are Michigan State fans, my condolences. I couldn't help but wear my Wolverine colors this morning. But seriously, the land-grant university system is one of the glories of our nation. To take farmers and to make sure that they had all of the best scientific methods of raising crops, and then with the Transcontinental Railroad, getting those great crops to market. Lincoln had this vision that was just remarkable for our country. So the Morrill Act that he signs into law establishes the land-grant system. And I went to a land-grant college as an undergraduate. I went to Colorado State University before I went to University of Michigan. And then, of course, the Homestead Act then would people the West, who would be customers, who would be the suppliers to the farmers, and who would found new states on an equal footing with the states that were already in the Union. Genius. Lincoln is the guy who really, he knew that once we got through the Civil War, that his vision would prevail in modernizing America. So, great, great president. FDR, you all know, the United States had to fight an existential war, a two-front war. The Japanese on one side, the Pacific Theater, their empire, and the Germans, the Wehrmacht, on the sort of our Eastern Front. So FDR not only dragged us out of a depression with a high morale. I'm not arguing that his economic policies were all that good, but he knew how to keep Americans buoyant, confident in themselves, can do. We are going to get through this. And so we hit the ground running in World War II. And I want you to think about this one thing. How long did World War II last for the United States? Not even. I hear somebody say 4 years. Now, World War II starts September 1st, 1939, but not for us. It starts for us when? December 7th, 1940, so almost 2.5 years later. And by the time you get to VJ Day, late August, September of 45, 3 years, 9 months, we fought an existential two-front war and got the results we needed. Unconditional surrender from the belligerents, and we came out as the only major war power in the world in that war, stronger than when we entered it. That's genius. Think of how smart that brain trust and the generals like Marshall had to be to coordinate something like that. So this is why FDR, even though I grew up in a household that didn't like Lincoln and didn't like FDR, so you can imagine, I mean, I had to go to grad school to really learn the story about these presidents. Now, those are great presidents. Reagan's a great president, too, for a lot of reasons. Ford. We don't think of Ford in that company. But if I ask the question differently, if I say, who were great people in the White House? Who do you think of? Let's just set aside Ford for the time being. Who was a good human being? Somebody you would trust to babysit your grandkids, say. Did I hear somebody say Clinton? No. Oh, Carter. Barack Obama. Eisenhower. Who else? Kennedy. Oh, boy. Is there a place where we can go get scotch after this and we can just have a nice talk? Bush. Which Bush? Both Bushes. Okay. Okay, there's no question. There were scoundrels in the White House, and I would argue that Kennedy was one of them, and even my buddy Mark Updegrove. Kennedy, let's just get this out, and this is relevant for Ford. I mean, Ford and Kennedy, when they were both in the House together in the late 1940s, very early 1950s, were very friendly with each other, and they respected each other for the work they did. And Ford, remember, was on the Warren Commission. He was the last living member of the Warren Commission, which President Johnson had assembled a number of people to look, under Chief Justice Earl Warren, to look at the Kennedy assassination. And Ford served admirably on behalf of his friend to try to get to the truth. So Ford could separate the less than desirable behavior of Kennedy from the fact that he had many good human qualities. The less than desirable behavior, we've had the Secret Service come in and talk to students and the public about Kennedy's inexcusable behavior of using the Secret Service, your taxpayer dollars, to procure women whenever he went on the road. Now, this is well established. He had many, many, many girlfriends. He was not a bachelor. It's a problem. If today's media had been around when Kennedy was president, I don't care if he was a Democrat or what party he's in, his behavior would have been exposed. And the problem with it is that his brother, who was, the Attorney General, was trying to prosecute the mob. But the mob bosses, like Sam Giancana in Chicago, and Kennedy were sharing the same women. This makes somebody bribable. Kennedy was a scoundrel in his personal life, but he had many good qualities as an administrator and as a leader. He inspired so many of my older brothers and sisters, your generation. He inspired so many of those folks on the positive side of the ledger, and that's what made him a very, very effective president. Okay. Ford. Let's get right to Ford now. Ford, we've established, is not mentioned in the gallery of great presidents. But does it make a difference that he was a really good man? How many people separate that out and say it really doesn't matter? You want a strong president, whether he's good or not in his personal life is irrelevant. The question is, would you rather have a good man who's not so sterling a president, or a good president who's not so sterling a man? This is often the dilemma we're faced with, is it not, as Americans? Well, I'm going to argue that actually Ford is a much better president than he gets credit for. He's often overlooked. The conditions under which he came into office, of course, were very unusual. Unique in American history. He became vice president for the first time under the terms of the 25th Amendment, succession, because believe it or not, after Kennedy was shot, you assumed that Johnson, of course, would go from vice president to president, but Johnson didn't have totally solid ground to appoint a vice president. So the 25th Amendment was written, it was passed in 1967, and so it would be operative when President Ford was in office. So when Richard Nixon, our 37th president, resigns, Vice President Ford then can go to the presidency. But that's then because prior to that, you'll recall that Spiro Agnew had resigned, and so Nixon needed a vice president. So you kind of see this little domino effect that the 25th Amendment provides for. And so Ford was able to be a constitutional president without ever having been elected by the American people to serve as vice president or president. So he was sort of the accidental president. He's been called by many monikers that kind of question his legitimacy in some sense. And you heard those really kind of go from a trickle to a roar after the most famous thing he did, 30 days in office, when he pardoned Richard Nixon. Now, a lot of people at that point were very upset. And the Gallup poll readings confirmed that the American people were upset because President Ford's his approval ratings sank more overnight with the pardon of Richard Nixon than any other president at that point in polling history. Boy, did he pay dearly for that. But was he a good president to do that? This is where I think it's important to look at political interest and the interest of trying to win the next election versus what's the long-term interest of the American people. The really good presidents, they don't have to be great for what I'm about to say, but the really good presidents don't just look at the next election. They're looking at what is good. What is the common ground that they can find for the greater good? Now, this is very important. Common ground for greater good. Now, today, and let's take a little poll. I think we all know here what we're talking about. How many of you watch cable TV? I'm just curious. Demographically, our age group watches more cable TV than any other group in the country, demographically. How many of you watch MSNBC? How many of you watch Fox? How many of you watch both? Yeah, I think a lot of us are going to get a lot of news that way. But what is the methodology? The methodology of those news presentations is often to start not at the center. That's not the business model. The business model is not to say, where is the center of the population in terms of any given issue? Immigration, abortion, foreign policy, oil, crime, education. They don't start at the center. Their business model, they're aware of the center, but their business model then is only to identify the center so that they can then attract the clickbait on their websites and the viewing hours on your TV set. So MSNBC tends to go pretty far left in its guests. Fox News tends to go pretty far right in its guests. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I think discerning voters, discerning citizens, are intelligent enough to watch both and then come to your own conclusions. That's what I do. But let's take this idea of the center. President Ford, and I would argue President Kennedy, for example, had a very different model. President Ford would look at a problem that the American people faced. Take the energy crisis, because we're looking at it now, or take inflation. Those were two issues that President Ford had to deal with in the same way that we're dealing with that to some extent today. President Ford would, as the minority leader from 1965 on, of the Republicans in the House, he would look at where was the center for the American people. He'd come back home, he'd talk to people. He traveled all over the place. He talked to people. He was in touch not just with his colleagues in Washington. It wasn't just a bubble for him. He was in touch with the American people. He went to all kinds of, dinners, the rubber chicken circuit, and they weren't all campaign-type stops. He had his Quonset hut. He liked talking to people, and he liked people. He was a Republican, of course, but he liked Democrats. He enjoyed talking to them. This is why Jack Kennedy, was a friend of his. He enjoyed the interaction. So he had a real good barometer, a sense for what is the center, where are we in the center? And then he would go to his counterpart for an issue like energy or inflation. He would find his counterpart in the Democratic Party who shared the same virtues and values that he did, the love of democracy, the love of our Constitution, real appreciation for what this country is and has been able to achieve in a remarkably short time, historically speaking. And he would forge, through conversation, he would forge what would be sort of the seeds of fighting, inflation, fighting energy, whatever the issue was. And then he would work out from there. You see the contrast, ladies and gentlemen. Today, our politics starts at the outside and tries to work in to the extent it can, to the extent that people won't be punished or primaried. His method was entirely different, to start at the center, roughly the center, find it, center of gravity there, where people can be R's and D's and it's okay. And then you work out from there. Because they knew that first they were Americans before they were R's and D's. They knew they had to do the people's business. They had to find common ground for the greater good. It's prima facie obvious why. It's obvious. Okay, so say I'm on the far, so I'm on your right? Yeah, say I'm on the far right. And my team wins. And I gather the other people who are on the farthest part of the right spectrum, and we craft legislation, and we jam it down the other side's throats. This happens. And then what if the other side wins? Then they undo everything that we worked hard to do, and it's gone. What if I'm on the far left? Same thing. One of the signature pieces of legislation and initiatives of President Obama, for instance, was the Affordable Care Act. Not one Republican voted for it. So you have your tribe, all of them, who are going to vote in one way, and then it passes, and then look at what happens in the next election. Who's the president who followed Trump? I just followed Obama. Trump talked about it again and again. How can he erode the Affordable Care Act or Obamacare? That's not a sustainable model for democracy. We don't want that. Do you know that 75% of Democrats, 75% of Democrats, 75% of Republicans, not only would they not want their daughter to date, somebody from the other party, but they think the other party is responsible for eroding democracy. 70 to 75%. Think of that. So we're in a very dangerous situation right now. Or if you take the report that just came out showing that threats to people in Congress have gone up tenfold between 2016 and 2021, early 2022. Tenfold increase in threats. I'm going to keep it bipartisan. You don't need to know how I vote, what my registration is, or anything like that. We're going to keep this bipartisan. Both sides bear responsibility for this. And both sides have got to work together somehow to get us out of it. If the Democrats make up about 30% of the electorate, Republicans make about a 30%, we're very evenly divided. That's more than a plurality. That's a majority. We need people of goodwill on both sides. We need somebody like President Ford. We need somebody with his vision and his method. And this is what makes him a much better president than we realize. We're going to get to Q&A here pretty soon, and I imagine you will test some of my thesis here. But before we get there, how long do we have before Q&A starts? 10 minutes. Okay, this will give me enough time then. When you come to the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Museum, you come to a remarkable site. How many of you have been there? Okay, anybody in the room? Not. Okay, you come to the museum. I will give you tell me you're at the HASP lecture, I will give you free admittance to the museum, okay? Now, don't the rest of you take advantage of that now. I know Christmas is coming and all your family are coming and all that kind of stuff, but I'd get in real trouble. But for those of you who've not been there before, I would be delighted to welcome you into this temple of democracy called the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Museum. My office is, I'm the director of the foundation, and we're upstairs. The adjacent office to mine is actually President Ford's working office from 1981 to 2006. Now, it's a remarkable site, first of all, because that part of Grand Rapids is really beautiful. You have the river going through Michigan's longest river. The rapids are going to be restored there. The Nabawan Park. I always show visitors, there are these 3 Native American mounds. And if you sight, down these mounds, and these mounds are reconstructions, but there were original mounds there at one time that go back to the Hopewell culture, 2,000 years old. Contrast those mounds, then you look across that beautiful river with the skyscrapers of Grand Rapids hugging the riverbank on the other side, the left bank of the river. And I always ask people, do you think President Ford, who used to say when he couldn't sleep at night, he used to think of these scenes in Grand Rapids along the river, and do you think that he contrasted these Indian mounds that were 2,000 years old with the gleaming new buildings of a robust civilization, and it not occur to him or to anybody who's thinking about this? How do we keep from being 2,000-year-old mounds that are just the work of archaeologists at this point? How do we keep our civilization alive and thriving? I did a little research project. I asked one of my colleagues over in Ann Arbor at the library, I said, would you please get me President Ford's Michigan transcript? I want to see what his first course was. What was his first class at the University of Michigan? It was actually it was a history class. He got an A in it. It was his best grade that semester. And the history class was about what happened after the fall of Rome. He got an A in that class. Because what happened after the fall of Rome, it was so difficult for civilization. Rome falls, in the 400s, 500s, and it takes 3 civilizations to take Rome's place. The Byzantine Empire, the Islamic Empire, and Western Europe, Christendom, what used to be called Christendom. Think about that. President Ford was getting lectures on what happens when a civilization falls. And then he goes to war, and he sees it right in front of him. He can't take for granted, after being in uniform and fighting and almost losing his life on numerous occasions, he could not take it for granted that this civilization would last. Certainly not in its current form, where freedoms are honored, human rights are honored. That's not guaranteed. There have been 28 civilizations, according to Arnold Toynbee. Only 4 of them are left. Now, this ties, I think, to something else in Ford's method. Not only, we talked about the centrism, so we're starting at the center. That's the method. But the second thing is, and I just hinted at it earlier, is to make sure that what you're talking about ultimately is not just the next election, but what are the policies that are truly for the common good, the greater good. How do we find common ground for the greater good? Because that's how we survive. But it takes somebody who's been in war, somebody who's studied history and understands how fragile civilization is, to understand that. Ford had that awareness, and it really was brought home to us. If you read today or go back and listen to all of his speeches in 1976. What was happening in 1976? The bicentennial, the 200th anniversary. And by the way, in 2026, we're going to have the sesqua bicentennial or something like that. But the point is, this country will be celebrating a quarter of a millennium. Raise your sights. President Ford was a civilizational president. His speech at Valley Forge, for example, July 4th, 1976, he talks about the fragility of civilization, how important it is that we take care of our civilization. This is a huge vision. Now we're starting to talk about greatness. And had he been elected for the first time as president in the campaign of 1976, he would have enacted this. Richard Norton Smith, whom Milt mentioned in the canon of great historians, great presidential historians, Richard Norton Smith is finishing about an 900-page biography of Ford. It will come out on April 11th, 2023. And Richard, I've been very privileged to be able to read a couple of the chapters, but Richard is going to show this pivot that President Ford makes from healing the nation after Watergate and losing our first major war in Vietnam, the environmental crisis, the energy crisis, the people's collapse of trust in their government, civilizational issues. President Ford comes in and he knows that he must help heal the nation. That's what the pardon's about, and that's what, he's trying to restore trust by his own example of personal integrity. And then in 1976, that's from 1974 to 76, in 76 he pivots. And now he wants to take on these very large issues that are important to us as more than just R's and D's, but as a civilization. Because he had seen firsthand what happens when civilizations weaken and fight each other and disintegrate from within. So Ford offers a lot if we raise our sights to seeing him in a different way. When you come to the museum, this will be my last point before we go to Q&A. When you come to the museum, what I think makes that temple of democracy so interesting is that, yes, it has all the objects, and oh, does it have objects. Some 20,000 objects, and there's stories behind each of them. And the stories are wonderful. For example, I like to point out, this will be one example I'll give you out of the museum. Everywhere in the museum you see pipes. The reproduction of the Oval Office, the reproduction of the Cabinet Room, his congressional desk. Everywhere you go in that museum you see pipes, and sometimes a lot of pipes. President Ford smoked 10 bowls full of tobacco every day. Now, he wasn't inhaling. I love it. This audience gets all the jokes. They get all the puns. It's good. He didn't inhale. No, but what it meant was, when he was with people, strong personalities, the Henry Kissingers, the Alan Greenspans, the Dick Cheneys, the Don Rumsfelds, strong personalities in his cabinet. And he had let them duke it out. He'd sit there and let them duke it out. He'd just listen. God gave him one mouth but two ears. He'd sit there and listen. And at the end, if he had made his decision, he would just say, okay, Carla, Secretary Hills, and gentlemen, I've made my decision. He just let them exhaust themselves with arguing and that kind of thing. It was a contentious cabinet. In fact, a friend of mine, Tevi Troy, has written a book called Fight House, and the Ford White House was indeed a fight house. Tevi came in and talked about it a little bit in June. So Ford was that's an object that's more, people walk through the museum, they don't understand necessarily, if they haven't read a biography, that pipe was an object of leadership. It meant that leaders listen, leaders learn, they ask questions, and they withhold their firepower until everybody has spoken. They had all the different viewpoints presented of the stakeholders, and then you are competent to make a decision. That's the way President Ford worked, which reinforces the whole idea of the center that we were talking about, and the gravity of the things he worked with and the civilizational issues he dealt with after World War II, and him going through the Depression and then facing the crises he faced in the 1970s. So, that museum is a great place to learn about leadership and virtue and the methods that President Ford mastered that we could sure use today. So I hope I see you down there. Now let's have some Q&A. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Gleaves. Pat and I are ready to take your questions for Gleaves. So if you have a question, please raise your hand.
It's not a question, but a funny comment that's true about Ford at center. 24 years after Gerald Ford played center on Grand Rapids South football team, I did.
Big shoes to fill. Now, this is an interesting point. You did not ask a question, but I will turn it into one.
Okay.
So it's interesting, isn't it? There are two things I want you to be aware of about Ford. So you might ask, what is the significance of playing center on a football team? You're at the center, right? You're at the center.
You handle the ball every time.
That you're handling the ball, and you're often leading the sweeps left or right or just straight down the middle. So the center is a very important player, especially in the 1930s on the teams. So think about Ford's name also, his position and his name, Ford. What's a Ford? Not the car. What's a ford in the natural landscape? It's a river crossing. Mm-hmm. So back in England, I would imagine the fords were named after people who knew how to get from the right bank to the left bank. How symbolic that the center and also kind of a bridge builder, uniter, has that as a last name. I find it fascinating. So anyway, congratulations for surviving a center football team.
With the outsized or oversized impact of social media right now, how hopeful are you that a leader will emerge who can unite us?
Okay, here's my little sociology lesson for the day. Excellent question. Thank you for that. You know, a healthy society has a very steep bell curve. You know, if you have, you know, a steep bell curve, then for those of you who've had statistics, you know, you have these lines and, you know, 1 deviation out, 2 deviations, and so forth. But the tails are very short. So that means that most people in a really healthy society are in the middle, and the extremists are rare. What we have seen happen in this country over the last 50 years is a flattening of our American bell curve. So now it looks like this. The tails have grown enormously big vis-a-vis the hump, where we want to be. Now that means if you equip the tails, left and right, again, we're going to be bipartisan here, we're going to use good method here. If you equip the tails with a microphone, I mean, you can start out with newspapers and then the telegraph, and they can make headway, and then you go to microphones, TV, yeah. Give them social media, where now they have an amplification that no extremists in the tails in human history have ever had, that amplification, then they are in a position to troll, to misdirect public discussion, to redirect it, to do really damaging things to our democracy. And that's exactly what's happening. The tails have gotten so strong, where the tails in a healthy society, say what we were in the 50s and the 60s, you know, the tails were, you know, like 5% extremists. The beatniks, for Pete's sake. How many beatniks were there? And how many John Birchers were there really compared to what the extremists are today? So I think that the problem has become so serious an issue for our constitutional republic, our democracy. We haven't found a solution for that yet. Congress is trying to figure out how do we legislate, social media. That's only skimming the surface because the underlying anger, the underlying issues remain. And we've become so partisan, hyper-partisan now. Partisan doesn't even do it justice for what we've become now. I think we're in serious trouble, and social media's role in that has been huge. Now, do I use social media? Yeah, to some extent. I'm dependent on it. It has to be used responsibly, though. But there are too many people out there who get their kicks out of trolling and just, business. Let's face it, the business model, the social media business model, we were talking earlier about business models, cable TV and that kind of thing, but the social media business model is to anger you so that there's clickbait, and then they sell more advertisement. So, we have a fundamental problem. I don't know how you overcome the business model there now that Pandora box has been opened. We need a Gerald Ford. But here's a question for you. Could a Gerald Ford be elected today, president? Raise your hands if you think so. Oh, come on. I always need a contrarian. Not one of you thinks that? Milt. That's my man. Okay. Somebody has to step into the void. Is it possible that we will just exhaust ourselves? Is it possible that we will become such a violent country in the next decade or so? We are like kind of what the Civil War, the 1850s, before the Civil War actually happened. And then we have these surrogate civil wars, bleeding Kansas and elsewhere. Are we approaching something like that? Maybe. Now, again, we're going to talk about the left and the right before we leave this point. The left and centrists look at January 6th, and they say, this is prima facie evidence. We are coming apart at the seams. The right looks at the left, and they look at what happened in the wake of George Floyd's murder, and they say, well, yeah, if you look then at what happened in Portland and in Washington State, in Seattle, and other cities. I think there were 25 cities in all, where public officials, courthouses were actually occupied or threatened. Courthouses. Now, that's not January 6th, I understand, but the cumulative impact of that was not good either. So we got both sides, whether you're Proud Boys or Antifa. We got some bad dudes out there, bad actors on both sides. And social media just inflames. So we have a long way to go. But Ford's my man. When we come through it, Ford's my man for healing the nation, because we need healing desperately, and for setting us on a sane course again. Yes?
How does one discover or learn the truth from media? And which media, if at all?
I had a very wise college professor who told me that we have very few absolute truths. I'm going to say something that might be controversial, and I mean no disrespect by saying this. But even faith is not apodictic truth. That's why it's called faith. You cannot absolutely prove it to another human being. You might know it in your heart, but it's not a community truth necessarily. This means that so much of what we do in public policy, when we're debating what to do next, so much of it, it's not apodictic truth. There's some things that you absolutely want to believe. For example, if we're attacked, if innocent civilians are attacked, we have a sense as human beings that is wrong, and it deserves a response. And if we don't respond, we encourage further attacks. That's kind of a commonsensical thing that we would treat as an absolute. Injustice. When we see injustice, we're We say in English, justice is outraged, and it calls for a moral response. But if we're talking energy policy, we're talking immigration, crime, it's so hard to know absolutely what to do to find common ground for the greater good. So what you have to do in that case is read a lot of different things if you have the time. I read lots every day, left and right. I do think that it makes me sad to see people get in their bubbles and then just get comfortable with sort of one side or the other. And especially Thanksgiving's coming up, right? We want to get along around the Thanksgiving table. You know, you don't want that cantankerous uncle or that feisty aunt, to start, saying things that are just going to get everybody mad. I see a lot of heads nodding. I mean, we all know the type, and we have to keep people separated. But I think it's worse now. And just one other thing about that: my parents. I mean, I think of the things that I look at their world in the 50s and the 60s. There was such a consensus then. I mean, even if you were reading the New Republic on the left and National Review on the right, they basically believed in the Constitution. They basically believed in kind of a free market capitalism with, some regulations. They basically believed in our culture. All that's on the table now. So what do you read to navigate that? Ooh, it's hard. But keep trying. We keep trying. I read the New York Times, the Washington Post. I read National Review. I read all over, the whole spectrum, until you get to the crazies. I don't read that stuff. And the conspiracy theories. Too many of my in-laws are out there in the conspiracy theories.
We got one more question. One more question over there.
Oh, sorry.
On a lighter note.
Where is the speaker? Oh, yes, sir.
On a lighter note, I read yesterday that some people feel that the situation in Ukraine right now and the risk of using nuclear weapons is perhaps more dangerous than the Cuban Missile Crisis.
This is a light note.
Yeah. Well, it's something we don't really want to think very much about right now. How would you respond to that?
I think it's true. Because you're dealing with, Goethe said, beware the man who has little to lose. If you back somebody into a corner and he or she feels that there is little to lose, beware that person. Putin has staked everything on reviving the Russian Empire. He even says the Dnieper River that unites the people of Ukraine with the people of Russia, that the Russians and the Ukrainians were baptized in the same waters of the Dnieper. To which I want to ask President Putin, why would you bomb then your brothers and sisters in Ukraine? Mm-hmm. If you share the faith, and that's what Putin believes, that the Orthodox Church and the Russian Empire are a necessary unity. Well, then go back and read St. Augustine's just war theory. Absorb it. That's not happening. It's going to take really wise leaders around the world, and especially in America, since the U.S. is still considered the strategic, military, and moral leader of the world, despite the inroads that China has made in the last couple of decades. But how do you navigate that? I think we're in a very dangerous time. I talked to my kids about this. I just asked them questions when we were driving along. They're in their 30s and 20s. And I talked to my kids. I said, what are you worried about these days? It kind of helps me stay in touch, Possible ABC war, atomic, biological, chemical war, really getting out of hand, changing the very nature of life on this earth. No wonder they don't get married. No wonder they don't want to have kids like our generation did, or the parents of the baby boomers. There's a lot of dark stuff out there. Do you have a truly light note? I do think we ought to leave on some kind of a light note.
Leave on a good uplifting note here.
Come to the Ford, because you know what?
Yes.
You will see the beautiful thing about the Ford, and I'll end on this, is that it's got all these objects like the pipes and everything that I told you about, but it also has the virtues of President Ford: team player, compassionate, integrity, open, hardworking, all those West Michigan values we celebrate. And when you go through, this is why the Temple of Democracy there is so impressive, and there's no other museum quite like it, where you actually see a virtue written on the wall, and then you see an example of it in the history that it unfolds. And I tell students, we have a lot of students coming in now. I'm launching what's called the Ford Leadership Forum, and we have a lot of students coming in, and I say, here's the beautiful thing about virtue. You don't have to go read a textbook to know. You know the 4 categories of virtue. I'll be very fast. The 4 categories. Her face just sank. She heard me say, she knows I'm a professor. I could see it. Her face just, she's like a deflated balloon. I promise to be brief.
Are you okay?
Moral virtue, character virtue. And we have a conscience. If we're not a sociopath, we have a conscience that guides us in how to progress. You don't need a textbook for that. Intellectual virtue. Aristotle said the intellectual virtues help us understand why we act on the moral virtues we do. The intellectual virtues, to make a good argument, to spot fallacies, to not fall for misinformation. Those are intellectual virtues. Then, as human beings, we have a natural exuberance to share the moral and intellectual virtues, and those are called civic virtues. We go out into the public square and share the best of ourselves. We inspire others to find the better angels in their nature in order to form a more perfect union. And then finally, so important, the spiritual virtues, which means we never despair. We never let ourselves despair, because all kinds of trouble comes in the wake of despair. We stay hopeful, and not merely optimistic, that's only as deep as the optic nerve, but hopeful, a deep sense of hope that we're going to get out of this if we work hard and have goodwill toward others. Thank you very much.
Thank you. This has been an outstanding program today, and I want to personally thank Gleaves for the insight that he has brought to us. And I, too, encourage all of you to visit or revisit the Gerald R. Ford Museum. And what is written in the quotes on the wall, I have taken pictures of myself just to keep reminding myself of what you said about those virtues. It is important, and all of you have the ability, because you sat here and you listened and you learned, to make a difference. So on November 8th, a week from today, remember how important it is, no matter where you vote, how you vote, but vote. That is what a democracy is about. And that is what makes it a democracy in our country. Next month, we won't be quite as heavy. We're going to listen to the Holland Chorale sing for us. So I invite you back in December, and have a wonderful day and a very happy Thanksgiving. Thank you.